A public IP address. This can be associated with a virtual machine network interface card, internet-facing load balancers, VPN gateways, and application gateways. If you choose dynamic assignment, then Azure will provide you with an IP address. You can also assign the IP address statically, and that then would be a static assignment. The type of resource affects the assignment. So depending on whether it's a virtual machine, load balancer, VPN gateway, or an application gateway, your options to select dynamic or static will be limited. In case of each of these options, you have the dynamic assignment option. But if you have a VPN gateway or an application gateway, you cannot set a static IP address to these two resources. If I have to create a public IP address, I'll just click on the search box and type public IP address and then select public IP address from the drop down menu. And then as you see, I've got a couple of these public IP addresses assigned to the virtual machines that we have created during the lab. But let's go create a new one. I'll click on this add and we'll get a blade to create a public IP. You have the options to select between IPv4, IPv6 or both. And then what's important to understand is the SKUs. You have the option of basic and standard. Let's understand these. So when you select a basic SKU, you have the option for either static or dynamic. But with standard, you can only have a static IP address assignment. With basic, you have open security by default, but with standard, you get better security options. That means that you are secure by default and any inbound traffic is closed. You can assign a basic SKU to all virtual machines with their network interfaces, VPN gateways, application gateways, and internet-facing load balancers. With standard SKUs, they can only be assigned to network interfaces, which is virtual machines, or public standard load balancers. Basic SKUs are not zone redundant by default, but standard SKUs are zone redundant by default. That means if something happens to your network interface, then the traffic will be routed to a different zone. That's what makes it zone redundant. And that's the default behavior for standard SKUs. I'll choose basic at this time and then give it a name. Just call it a web server. And then you have the option of choosing a dynamic IP address allocation or a static. I'll leave it to dynamic at this time. You can also select idle timeout minutes. This is the number of minutes it will keep a session alive. In DNS name label, I should type a unique name that's not assigned to any other public IP address in this subscription or outside this subscription. So if I type public web server, it will then be validated and then looks like this is not assigned to any other web server. Subscription, I'll leave it the way it is and put it in my resource group in East US and then finally click on create. So I have a public IP address of dynamic IP address assignment. As you see, it is getting deployed at this time. It'll take a minute to show up on the public IP address interface. Okay, as you see that the web server public IP address is created, I'll click on it and then you can assign it to either a virtual machine or to a load balancer. Let's click on associate button and see what happens. Now in the drop down menu, you have the options to select either a load balancer or a network interface, right? So when I click on network interface, it will show all the network interfaces in East US region. The one that is connected to my virtual machine is public network card. I can just click on it and say okay. So now this web server public IP address is associated to my network interface, which is then connected to my virtual machine. There you go. On the right hand side, you have the virtual machine name as well to which it is associated. Once you are done with your work, you can always disassociate it and just click on yes. That means that this web server public IP address is getting detached from the network card. So this network card called public network card will not have this IP address anymore. Once you're done with your lab, make sure that you go ahead and delete it just by clicking on delete and yes. In the next lab, we'll see how do you create a private IP address and attach it to your network interfaces.